A United States Army Special Forces captain stood on the dusty edge of an airstrip at Bien Hoa in the spring of 1966, looked across the tarmac at a lean, sunburned Australian soldier wearing a sandy-colored beret with a metal Excalibur badge on a black shield, and laughed in his face. He stepped forward, pointed at the beret, and said the 7 words that would echo through the rest of his career. "You did not earn that beret, mate." He told the Australian his cap was a fashion accessory, his rifle was a museum piece, his unit was a knockoff of someone else's reputation, and his entire country was sending Boy Scouts to do a real soldier's job. He turned to his Green Beret team and grinned. The Australian did not blink. He did not raise his voice. He just nodded once, slowly, the way a stockman nods when a city kid says cattle don't bite. Then he picked up his pack, walked past the captain without a word, and disappeared into the back of a waiting caribou bound for a province most Americans had never heard of, called Phuoc Tuy. 6 months later, that same Special Forces captain was sitting in a briefing room at Nha Trang, the headquarters of the 5th Special Forces Group, listening to a senior Green Beret major describe the new MACV Recondo school curriculum. The major was explaining who the cadre instructors would be, the men who would teach American long-range reconnaissance patrol candidates how to survive in the jungle. He listed the names, then he paused and added one more category. There were going to be Australian instructors at the school, SAS troopers. The major said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, like everybody already knew, like, of course, the Americans were going to learn jungle reconnaissance from Australians. The captain felt his face go hot. He thought about the airstrip at Bien Hoa. He thought about the man in the sandy beret. He thought about what he had said. And he understood, sitting there in that briefing room, that he had just spent 6 months of his career mocking a soldier who was about to teach his own men how to stay alive. This story is reconstructed from documented patterns of interaction between Australian SAS troopers and U.S. Special Forces personnel in Vietnam between 1965 and 1971. The specific captain and the specific airstrip exchange is illustrative, a composite scene built from the accumulated record of culture shock, professional friction, and eventual respect between 2 of the most capable special operations communities of the war. The arc itself, however, the arrogance, the humbling, and the quiet moment when American Green Berets realized the Australians in the strange beige headgear knew things their own training had never taught them, is real, repeated, documented, and deeply embarrassing for the institution that lived through it. Stay with me, because to understand why one Anzac trooper at Bien Hoa was worth 100 lectures from a Green Beret captain, we have to go back to where that sandy beret came from and what it cost the men who wore it. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment was raised on the 25th of July, 1957, originally as the 1st Special Air Service Company of the Royal Australian Infantry, headquartered at Campbell Barracks in Swanbourne, a quiet seaside suburb of Perth in Western Australia. For the first 7 years, the unit was little more than a paratrooper company. Its men wore the maroon airborne beret of the Royal Australian Regiment with the standard Infantry Corps cap badge, and they were considered competent jumpers, but not yet a special operations force in any meaningful international sense. That began to change on the 20th of August 1964, when the company was expanded to a full regiment with 3 Sabre squadrons, a training squadron, and a headquarters element. The new unit was modeled deliberately on the British 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, with which it shared the motto, "Who dares wins," and it adopted the same regimental philosophy of small unit, deep penetration, intelligence-driven warfare that the British SAS had refined in the deserts of North Africa during the Second World War and the jungles of Malaya during the emergency. The Sandy Beret itself was approved in the mid-1960s, replacing the maroon paratrooper headgear and signaling the regiment's separate identity from conventional airborne forces. It was made from a fawn-colored wool with a sandy synthetic headband, 4 cotton-reinforced ventilation eyelets, and a black cotton lining. The badge was the distinguishing feature. Where the British SAS wore a woven cloth-winged dagger, the Australians chose a metal cap badge, a downward-pointing sword Excalibur, wreathed in flames issuing upward from its hilt, with a gold scroll across the blade carrying the regimental motto, all set on a black shield-shaped felt patch. To anyone who understood Commonwealth military heraldry, the difference between the cloth British badge and the metal Australian one was immediate and meaningful. The Australians had taken the British design and made it their own, just as they had taken British SAS doctrine and rebuilt it around the lessons of their own jungle war. To earn that beret, an Australian soldier had to survive a selection course that produced failure rates between 70 and 90%, depending on the year and the cohort, followed by a reinforcement cycle that ran for roughly 16 to 18 months and included specialist courses in weapons, basic patrolling, parachuting, combat survival, signals, medical, demolitions, methods of, entry, and close-quarter combat. By comparison, the United States Army Special Forces qualification course of the same era ran approximately 12 months. The Australian process was longer, more selective, and far more focused on small team independence. Only after completing the entire reinforcement cycle was a candidate awarded the Sandy Beret and posted to a Sabre squadron. Crucially, when an Australian soldier received that beret, he was usually given the rank of trooper, which often meant a reduction from his previous rank in another unit. He took a pay cut, a rank cut, and a status cut for the privilege of being allowed to wear the beige headgear. That was what it cost. That was what it meant. And that was what the Special Forces captain at Bien Hoa, in our reconstructed exchange, did not understand when he sneered at it. The first significant encounter between Australian conventional forces and American conventional forces in Vietnam happened not at Bien Hoa in 1966, but earlier, in the spring and summer of 1965. Prime Minister Robert Menzies had announced on the 29th of April 1965 that an Australian infantry battalion would be deployed to South Vietnam, and the unit selected was the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, known throughout the Army as 1RAR. The battalion was originally commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Lou Brumfield, including its supporting elements: a troop of M113 armoured personnel carriers from the 4th/19th Prince of Wales's Light Horse, the 105th Field Battery from the Royal Australian Artillery, a New Zealand Artillery Battery from the 161st Field Battery, and the 161st Reconnaissance Flight Operating Cessna 180A and Bell H-13 Sioux helicopters. The deployment totaled approximately 1,400 personnel. Together they were attached to the United States 173rd Airborne Brigade under Brigadier General Ellis W. Williamson, based at Bien Hoa, with a mission to help establish what was called the Bien Hoa Vung Tau Enclave. From the moment one RAR arrived at Bien Hoa Air Base in May and June of 1965, the differences in tactical philosophy between the Australians and their American hosts were impossible to disguise. The 173rd Airborne Brigade fought the way American airborne brigades had been trained to fight since the late stages of the Second World War. Heavy firepower, helicopter mobility, large-scale sweeps, search and destroy. The brigade was designed for big formations and big noise, drawing the enemy to the Americans and then crushing them with overwhelming superiority in artillery, air support, and gunship coverage. One RAR fought a different war. The Australians had spent the previous decade absorbing the hard-won lessons of the Malayan emergency, where small British and Commonwealth patrols had defeated the Communist Malayan National Liberation Army through patient jungle craft, light footprint, silent movement, and intimate knowledge of the bush. They moved through jungle silently, kept off roads and tracks, and treated noise as something close to a tactical sin. According to oral histories preserved by the 1RAR Association, the two sides watched each other operate and quietly concluded that they were doing fundamentally different things in the same country. There was something else about that first deployment that the Americans found difficult to process. 1RAR arrived in Vietnam, carrying equipment that, by United States standards in 1965, looked like museum stock. The battalion was issued the Owen submachine gun, a Second World War-era 9mm Australian design that had served in the island's campaign against the Japanese. Their personal load-carrying gear was Second World War webbing. Their boots were called tropical studded boots and gaiters, and they were not jungle boots in any modern American sense. Their main rifle was the IL-1A1 self-loading rifle, the Australian variant of the Belgian FN FAL battle rifle in 7.62 NATO. An excellent weapon, accurate, hard-hitting, and respected internationally, but heavier and longer than the Americans' new lightweight M16 in 5.56 NATO. By the time the conversation between Australian and American operators turned to weapons, the 173rd paratroopers had already concluded that the Australians were under-equipped, underfunded, and tactically out of step with modern airmobile warfare. That conclusion was wrong, but it was understandable, and it was the foundation of every subsequent piece of arrogance that American operators showed toward Australian operators throughout the war. To understand the imagined exchange at Bien Hoa between our Special Forces captain and our SAS trooper, you have to understand that he was not seeing the Australian as he actually was. He was seeing the Australian through a filter built out of equipment lists, organizational charts, and assumptions about what professional warfare was supposed to look like. The captain saw old webbing and a heavy rifle and a tan beret with a metal badge, and he reasoned backward to a force that could not possibly know what it was doing. What he could not see was the Malayan jungle behind every one of those Australian soldiers, and the aboriginal tracking tradition sitting beneath the regiment's operational doctrine, and the 10 years of small war thinking that the Australian Army had built into its institutional culture, while the United States Army was still focused on stopping Soviet armor in the Fulda Gap. In late June of 1965, 1RAR began running operations alongside the 173rd. The Australian after-action reports from those operations, preserved in Australian military archives and quoted in unit histories such as the 1RAR Association's own published material, describe a slow, painful realization that operating under direct American tactical control was eroding Australian effectiveness. The Australians wanted to patrol in small groups, move silently, lay ambushes, and gather information. The Americans wanted them to participate in large airmobile assaults, sweep designated areas, and call in artillery fire on suspected enemy concentrations. Both approaches had merit in different contexts, but neither was a substitute for the other, and trying to do both at the same time produced friction that showed up in operational results. By the time one RAR's tour ended in mid-1966, the Australian government and the Australian Army had jointly decided that future deployments would not be attached to American brigades. Instead, an independent Australian task force would be established with its own area of operations, its own command structure, and its own freedom to fight the war in the Australian way. That decision produced the first Australian task force at Nui Dat in Phuoc Toi Province, established in April and May of 1966, and embedded within that task force was a single Special Air Service Regiment Squadron, the unit that would change the way American special operators thought about Australian capability. The first SAS squadron deployed to Vietnam was 3 Squadron, which arrived in country in June 1966. Each of the regiment's 3 Sabre squadrons would eventually rotate through Vietnam, completing 2 tours apiece between 1966 and the final withdrawal of 2 Squadron in October 1971. From 1968 onward, a New Zealand SAS troop was attached to each Australian squadron, integrated into Australian patrols, and operated under Australian command. Total ANZAC SAS strength in Vietnam at any given time rarely exceeded 150 operators. Across the entire war, only 580 Australian SASR personnel served in country. The numbers those small squadrons produced are the reason the Special Forces captain in our story eventually had to swallow his contempt. Over 6 years of operations, the Australian and New Zealand SAS in Vietnam conducted close to 1,200 patrols. They reported the movements of thousands of enemy personnel. They inflicted documented casualties of approximately 492 confirmed enemy killed in action, with another roughly 106 probable, plus 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, and 11 prisoners taken. Their own losses across all 6 years and all 1,200 patrols and approximately 580 operators rotated through theater totaled 1 man killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 killed accidentally, 1 missing in action, 1 death from illness, and 28 men wounded. By any measure that special operations professionals understand, kill ratio, mission completion rate, intelligence yield per patrol, friendly casualties per enemy engaged. The Australian SAS in Vietnam achieved one of the highest performance records of any Allied Special Operations unit in the entire war. The Viet Cong gave them a name for it. The North Vietnamese intelligence summaries and captured enemy documents preserved in Australian and American archives refer repeatedly to Australian troopers as Ma Rung, a Vietnamese term that translates as phantoms of the jungle. The phrase appeared in enemy operations orders, in interrogation reports of captured Viet Cong cadre, and in propaganda warnings circulated to Vietnamese fighters operating in Phuoc Tuy and the surrounding provinces. The label was not metaphorical. It was operational. Vietnamese commanders genuinely instructed their soldiers to avoid contact with Australian SAS patrols when possible, on the explicit grounds that engaging the Australians was likely to end with Vietnamese casualties and no Australian bodies to recover. Some accounts published in special operations media, including the Australian SAS Association's published history and articles in publications like SOFREP and We Are the Mighty, describe a reported bounty placed on Australian SAS heads, often quoted at $5,000 per operator. That specific dollar figure should be treated with caution. It is widely repeated in popular military history, but is difficult to verify against primary Vietnamese source documents. The fact of the fear, however, is well attested in the capture documentary record. The reasons for that fear came down to method. Australian SAS patrols in Vietnam typically operated in 5-man or 6-man groups, sometimes 4, inserted by helicopter from No. 9 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, and given missions that could last from a few days to nearly 3 weeks. The standard mode of movement was deliberate to the point of seeming impossible. Patrols would frequently progress at rates closer to 100 or 200 meters per hour during high-threat phases of a mission, freezing for extended periods after every few steps to listen, watch, smell, and feel the rhythm of the surrounding jungle. They were trained to step on roots, rocks, and firm ground rather than soft earth that would record their prints. They walked in streams when terrain allowed it. They brushed out tracks behind them with branches when there was no other option. They wore their hair longer than American convention permitted, used native or scent-neutral soap, and adjusted their diet before patrols to remove the chemical signatures that Vietnamese trackers used to identify Western troops by smell. Ironically, MACV-SOG operators eventually adopted versions of these same scent discipline techniques themselves, eating local food and smoking Vietnamese cigarettes before going behind enemy lines, as documented in declassified MACV-SOG accounts. When an Australian SAS patrol made contact with the enemy, the engagement was almost never a fair fight. The Australians had been taught, both formally in the regiment's tactical doctrine and informally through the lessons of Malaya and Borneo, that small patrols facing larger enemy formations had to overwhelm the firefight in the opening seconds. Their solution was a high rate of fire from every weapon in the patrol, often deliberately staggered and shifted to make a 5-man team sound like an entire platoon. Once initiative was seized, the patrol would either consolidate the ambush or break contact along a pre-planned route, depending on the mission. This is what the article in We Are the Mighty was describing when it noted that Anzac patrols, once in contact with the enemy, unleashed a barrage of fire designed to make the enemy believe there were more men on the opposing side than there really were. It was a deliberate doctrine of force amplification through controlled volume of fire, paired with the slow, silent movement that had positioned the patrol to ambush the enemy in the first place. While one ATF and the SAS squadron were settling into Phuoc Tuy in 1966, an entirely separate American institution was being born at Nha Trang. The same institution that would, within roughly a year, force our hypothetical Special Forces captain to face the Australian he had insulted at Bien Hoa on the 15th of September 1966 by direction of General William Westmoreland. The 5th Special Forces Group established the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Recondo School at Nha Trang. The school was born out of the Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol Training Program that Project Delta, designation B-52, had been running for selected American and Free World Military Assistance Forces personnel. Project Delta's training mission had grown beyond its capacity, and an agreement between Military Assistance Command Vietnam and the 5th Special Forces Group transferred the program into a dedicated school under the operational responsibility of the group's commanding officer, who served as the Recondo School's commandant. The MACV Recondo School ran a 3-week reconnaissance commando course capable of hosting up to 120 students, with classes of approximately 60 beginning every 2 weeks. Curriculum included map reading, intelligence gathering, weapons handling on both American and captured enemy systems, communications, advanced patrol medicine, helicopter insertion and extraction, forward air controller techniques with live ordnance and patrolling in all its forms, preparation, organization, security, intelligence collection, immediate action drills, and break contact. Procedures. The course culminated in a real combat patrol in the mountainous jungle between Nha Trang and Cam Ranh Bay, where graduating students operated under the direct supervision of instructor advisors. The school had an attrition rate of approximately 50% across its life, with reported figures sometimes ranging higher in particular cohorts. 2 students were killed during training patrols. The school was nicknamed by some of its alumni the deadliest school on earth, and its graduates received the Recondo patch and a permanent Recondo number entered into their personnel files. Across the school's lifespan from 1966 to 1971, total enrollment was approximately 5,626 students, of whom approximately 3,515 graduated. The student population came from across the Free World Military Assistance Forces. Among the foreign students, the published figures from the Recondo School's own unit history and from the article on Vietnam gear that summarizes that history list, approximately 296 South Koreans, 193 Thais, 130 South Vietnamese, 22 Filipinos, and 18 Australians who graduated from the course. There is some variation across published sources. The figure for Korean students is sometimes given as 269, but the broad shape of the international student body is consistent across multiple references. Now here is the part of the story that more than any other single fact would have dropped the smile from the face of any Special Forces captain who had recently mocked an Australian SAS trooper. The Recondo School did not just teach Australians, it also drew on Australians as instructors. According to the school's own preserved unit history, 4 liaison personnel were attached to the Recondo cadre at any given time. One of those 4 was an Australian warrant officer, drawn from the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam and from the SAS, who assisted in Recondo training and occasionally led American teams on actual combat patrols outside the wire. 3 additional liaison slots were filled by South Korean Special Forces personnel, including 1 officer and 2 non-commissioned officers who similarly accompanied American teams in the field. The Australian warrant officer was not a token presence. He was a graded instructor and team advisor, and his job included leading American long-range reconnaissance patrols into hostile terrain. Patrols on which the lives of American Recondo students depended on his judgment. Australian SAS involvement in American long-range reconnaissance training did not stop with the Recondo School cadre. From 1967 onward, Australian SASR personnel also provided instructors to the Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol Training Wing at the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam-operated Van Keep Training Center. This was a parallel pipeline that fed reconnaissance skills into the broader Allied effort, and it relied substantially on Australian Special Operations expertise. Beyond the schoolhouse, individual SASR operators served on direct exchange postings with American Special Forces units, with United States Navy SEAL teams, and with Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. The highly classified MACV-SOG, the Joint Special Operations Unit that ran cross-border reconnaissance and direct action missions into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. A small number of Australians on individual exchange conducted some of the most sensitive special operations missions of the entire war alongside their American counterparts. This is the operational reality our Special Forces captain at Bien Hoa would have run into when he started moving through the American Special Operations community after his initial deployment. The Australians were not just allies. They were embedded into the American Special Operations training infrastructure as instructors and graders. They were embedded into MACV-SOG itself as exchange operators on cross-border missions. They were teaching American long-range reconnaissance patrol candidates how to walk silently. They were teaching American Recondo students how to set ambushes that the Viet Cong could not detect. They were teaching American special operators how to read sign on a jungle trail, how to manage scent discipline, and how to compress a 5-man patrol into something that sounded like a platoon when it opened fire. The captain, who had sneered at the Sandy Beret on the airstrip at Bien Hoa in early 1966, was, by the end of that same year, statistically likely to find himself sitting in a classroom or a briefing tent listening to a man wearing exactly that beret tell him how to keep his soldiers alive. The first time it happened, somewhere in the long arc of American Recondo classes between late 1966 and early 1970, our captain probably tried to make it a joke. He probably leaned over to one of his Green Beret peers and made some remark about Australians teaching Americans how to fight. He probably expected a laugh. What he would have got if his peer had been paying attention to the war they were actually in was silence, because by the second half of 1966, anybody serving in the American Special Operations community in Vietnam who had been honest with himself for more than 5 minutes had already noticed something uncomfortable. The Australians were achieving better operational results, with smaller forces and lower casualties in the same kind of terrain against the same enemy. This was not opinion. This was math. While the 173rd Airborne Brigade was fighting hard, taking heavy casualties, and producing impressive enemy body counts in the open and semi-open terrain north of Bien Hoa, the Australian task force in Phuoc Tuy was producing the highest sustained kill ratios of any Allied force in Vietnam. The SAS squadron component of that task force was producing kill-to-loss ratios that were in a class of their own across the entire Allied effort. American senior officers visiting Phuoc Tuy sometimes interpreted the relative quietness of Australian operations as a lack of aggression. General Westmoreland himself, during a January 1967 visit to the task force, made comments that were widely interpreted as accusing the Australians of being insufficiently active. Australian Task Force Commander Brigadier Stuart Graham responded through formal channels, and the diplomatic friction was managed at the senior level. But the Australians did not change their methods. They continued patrolling Phuoc Tuy patiently, and they continued producing results that, by the standards a special operations professional would actually use, were extraordinary. By the time the captain at Bien Hoa understood what he was looking at, the Australian SAS warrant officer he had ridiculed on the airstrip was probably standing at the front of a Recondo classroom or out on a graded combat patrol with a 5-man team of American students whose mothers and wives would never know how close those students had come to dying before the Australians started teaching them how to walk through a triple canopy jungle without breaking a single twig. There is no documented record of any specific captain saying the words, "You did not earn that beret," to a specific Australian SAS trooper at Bien Hoa in 1966. That exchange, as I said at the beginning, is reconstructed, a composite drawn from the well-documented pattern of initial American dismissal of Australian operators, followed by professional reckoning, followed by deep institutional respect. But the reckoning is not invented. It is the load-bearing fact of the entire Australian Special Operations contribution to the Vietnam War. There is a particular moment in the broader history of that reckoning that deserves to be named, because it captures the texture of what was happening inside the American Special Operations community as the war progressed. The MACV Recondo School's curriculum and tactical methodology, developed initially out of Project Delta's experience and then refined across thousands of student patrols, eventually formed part of the foundational doctrine for the United States Army's modern long-range surveillance and Ranger reconnaissance capabilities. The 75th Infantry Regiment, formed from Vietnam-era long-range reconnaissance patrol units in February 1969, became the lineal ancestor of today's 75th Ranger Regiment. The patrol courses that the SASR runs in Australia today are described, in the regiment's own historical materials, as similar in shape and intent to the Recondo School curriculum that Australians helped to teach. The tactical bloodlines of two of the world's most respected special operations communities are intertwined, and a measurable share of that intertwining happened in places like Nha Trang and Van Keep between 1966 and 1971, with Australian SAS personnel standing at the front of the classroom. The captain who mocked the Australian beret at Bien Hoa in our reconstruction almost certainly survived his tour. He went home, served out his career, perhaps retired in Florida or North Carolina or Virginia. Somewhere in his footlocker, if he was the kind of man who saved things, there was probably a photograph of himself standing in the long grass at Bien Hoa in early 1966, grinning at the camera, his Special Forces patch on his shoulder and his green beret tucked under his epaulette. And somewhere, in another house, in a quiet town in Western Australia near the Indian Ocean, an Australian veteran the same age was looking at his own photograph from the same year. He was wearing a sandy beret with a metal Excalibur badge on a black shield. His L1A1 was slung across his chest. His sleeves were rolled up. His face was burned brown by sun and wind, and his eyes were narrowed against the glare. He had survived Phuoc Tuy. He had survived a war his country debated for decades. He had taught American soldiers in Nha Trang how to walk through a jungle without dying. He had been called Ma Rung by the men who hunted him, and he had earned the beret on his head twice over, once on the selection course at Swanbourne, and once again in the bush north of Nui Dat, where the only thing standing between him and a Viet Cong main force company was the doctrine he and his patrol mates had built across 2 campaigns and 10,000 silent steps. The lesson of Bien Hoa is not really about an arrogant American officer and a humble Australian soldier. The lesson is about what happens when one professional military culture confuses surface signals, equipment lists, beret colors, accent, organizational charts, public reputation, for actual capability, and another military culture quietly ignores those signals and concentrates on outcomes. The Americans had more men, more helicopters, more artillery, more aircraft, more money, more institutional reach, and more international prestige than the Australians could ever match. The Australians had Malaya, Borneo, the Aboriginal tracking traditions of the outback, the small war thinking of the imperial frontier, and a regiment whose selection process was designed to break candidates psychologically before it ever tested them physically. The Americans were not wrong that they were the dominant special operations force on the planet. They were wrong about who, in the specific terrain of South Vietnam in the late 1960s, was teaching whom how to do the job. Of the 580 Australian SASR personnel who served in Vietnam, only one was killed by direct enemy action, wounded on patrol and dying later of complications. The others lost across 6 years of war died accidentally, from illness or in tragic circumstances unrelated to direct contact, including the operator who slipped from a rope extraction over the jungle in 1969, whose remains were not recovered until August of 2008, almost 40 years after his death. The bond his comrades carried for him and the persistence of the Australian effort to bring him home are part of the same culture that produced the silent patrols, the slow movement, the high kill ratios, and the unshakable refusal to operate the way the Americans wanted them to operate. They earned the Sandy Beret in selection, they earned it again in Vietnam, and they earned it a third time when the most powerful special operations community on Earth quietly began asking them to teach. So the next time you read about a soldier wearing a sandy beret with a metal Excalibur on a black shield, remember the airstrip at Bien Hoa, remember the captain who laughed, and remember the man who walked past him without saying a word. Because somewhere in the long shadow of that exchange, in the records of the Recondo school at Nha Trang, and the dusty archive of MACV-SOG and the Vietnamese intelligence files that named the phantoms of the jungle, the Australian had the last word, and he never even had to raise his voice to say it.